Have you ever stood at a crossroads in life, torn between the pain of your past and the possibility of a new beginning? In the frozen heart of the Montana frontier, a weary nurse named Clara arrived at the wrong ranch, only to be met by a grieving rancher, Wyatt, and his silent little girl, Lyddie. One mistake, one storm, and suddenly, 3 broken souls were forced under the same roof. But what happens when grief collides with hope? When a child who has not spoken in years looks into a stranger's eyes and whispers, "God finally sent you to us," Wyatt must decide if he dares to love again. Clara must face the scars of her own past. And Lyddie, just a child, must trust that this time she will not be left behind. If it were you, would you open your heart, knowing it might break again, or would you keep it locked away, safe but empty? This is not just a love story. It is a story of family chosen in the harshest of places. Stay with us and let your heart remember. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss a love story that could have been your own. The bride had been sent to the wrong ranch, yet the little girl clung to her skirt and whispered, "God finally sent you to us." Montana Territory, winter of 1869. The wind carved across the plains like sharpened steel, driving snow into restless swirls that swallowed the horizon. Miles from the nearest settlement, the land stretched wide and white, solemn and merciless. At the edge of that desolation stood a woman. Clara Whitmore pulled her wool shawl tighter, her boots sinking into the deep drifts as she approached the dark outline of a ranch house. Her gloved hand trembled as she raised it toward the door. Before she could knock, the heavy wood creaked open. A tall man stood framed in the threshold. His eyes, gray and hard as stone, studied her as though she were some phantom. Deep lines cut around his mouth. His coat hung open just enough to reveal the worn revolver at his hip and the gleam of a gold band still on his finger. Clara steadied her breath. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "I was sent by the Frontier Matrimonial Agency. I am to marry a Mr. Hayes." The man blinked once, then his jaw tightened. "I am Wyatt Callahan," he answered, his voice clipped, "and I never ordered a bride." A gust of wind shoved against Clara's back, but she did not move. There must be a mistake. She pressed, trying to sound calm. The letter said Silver Creek Ranch. "This is Silver Creek, isn't it?" "It is," he replied flatly. "But there is no Hayes here. You came to the wrong ranch. Miss Whitmore." He turned slightly, ready to close the door. "Please," Clara urged, stepping forward. "The last stagecoach has already gone for Fort Redemption, and a storm is coming. I've nowhere else to go." Wyatt hesitated a long moment, then stepped aside. "You can come in. For tonight." Relief poured through her as she crossed the threshold. The warmth inside felt like a memory she had nearly forgotten. The house was plain, but sturdy stone fireplace blazing, rough-hewn furniture, walls that seemed too long without laughter. Clara set her small trunk near the door and looked around. A child's bonnet hung beside a rifle. A wooden toy horse rested by the hearth. On the mantel, half dusted, stood the portrait of a woman. "She passed 3 years ago," Wyatt said, stiff and guarded. "My wife." Clara lowered her gaze with respect. "I did not come to replace anyone," she answered softly. "I only have nowhere else to be." He said nothing, only gestured to the narrow hall. "You can sleep in the spare room. In the morning, I'll take you back to Fort Redemption." Clara wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She nodded and turned toward the hallway. Then, faint footsteps broke the silence. From the shadows of another room, a small figure appeared. A girl, no more than 5, barefoot in a faded blue nightdress. Her dark hair tumbled in uneven waves. Her face was pale, her wide eyes haunted by things no child should know. Wyatt froze, his hand moving instinctively to his side, not for his weapon, but for steadiness. The child walked straight to Clara. Without a word, she reached out and clutched the edge of Clara's skirt. In a fragile voice that had not been heard in 3 long years, the girl whispered, "God finally sent you to us." The room fell still. Wyatt's breath caught. "Lyddie," he murmured, stepping closer in disbelief. The child said nothing more, but her small grip tightened, pressing herself against Clara's warmth. Wyatt lowered to one knee, his face shadowed with shock. "She hasn't spoken?" he whispered. "Not since—" He could not finish. Clara bent down, her voice gentle. "Hello, sweetheart." "My name is Clara." The girl looked up, her lips trembling. "Are you going to leave too?" Clara's heart fractured at the sound. She touched the child's cheek. "No," she said softly. "Not tonight." Wyatt stood silent, his hands clenched, eyes torn between fear and wonder. At last, his voice softened. "Stay," he said, "at least until the storm passes." Clara nodded once, but in her heart, she knew the storm had already come, and she was already inside it. Perhaps he could not bring himself to move on. Wyatt Callahan remained distant, speaking only in short, clipped phrases, his eyes rarely meeting Clara's. And yet, despite his guarded silence, his hands told another story. Each morning, before Clara stirred from sleep, extra logs had been laid carefully across the fire. When the wind rattled the window in her room, he quietly nailed the loose panel shut. Once, noticing the crack in the kettle handle as she struggled to pour tea, he repaired it without comment. He worked not for thanks, nor to impress. It was as though he was patching the house itself, holding it together for someone he could not name. Clara saw, and she understood. Meanwhile, Lyddie began to unfurl like a hidden bloom reaching for the sun. At first, she lingered in corners, silent and watchful, her ragged doll pressed tight to her chest. She never strayed far from Clara, but she never came too close either. Days passed this way, the girl's dark eyes following every movement with quiet curiosity. One afternoon, Clara sat by the window, her needle threading patiently through the torn seam of her glove. Without a word, Lyddie crept forward and set a folded slip of paper on the table. Then, shy as a fawn, she darted away. Clara opened it slowly. It was a child's drawing. 3 stick figures stood beneath a bright yellow sun. A tall man, a woman with yellow hair, and a small girl holding their hands. Above the picture, in uncertain letters, was written a single word: Mama. The breath caught in Clara's chest. She pressed the paper to her heart, eyes stinging. The next morning, Lyddie appeared again, this time with a plate of biscuits. They were blackened on the edges, lopsided and heavy, but Clara received them as though they were a feast fit for royalty. She smiled warmly and ate every bite with gratitude. For the first time, Lyddie smiled back small, fragile, but real. As the week dragged on, the world outside lay buried beneath snow. But within the house, something thawed. One brittle afternoon, Clara sat outdoors with the child curled in her lap, reading softly from a worn Bible she had found on the shelf. Lyddie did not understand every word, but she listened with rapt attention, her small fingers tracing the fabric of Clara's sleeve. From the window, Wyatt watched. He said nothing, only stood with his arms crossed, his face shadowed. He did not interrupt. The warmth between the two females filled a silence he had long thought unbroken, a fragile fire that pushed back against the dark. Still, beneath the tender moments, something remained unspoken. There was a shadow that lingered behind the girl's silence, a weight in Wyatt's steady stare. The house was healing, but it was not yet whole. One night, searching in Clara's guest room for extra blankets, Wyatt noticed an envelope tucked beneath a shawl. The paper was unsealed. He hesitated, but curiosity and quiet sorrow pressed him forward. He opened it. The handwriting was neat, delicate. The words, however, were merciless. Her injuries have healed well enough. She may live a long and healthy life. However, the trauma to her abdomen has caused lasting damage. The likelihood of childbearing is minimal to none. Wyatt folded the paper as though it were fragile glass. His hands shook as he set it back down. That evening, the fire burned low. Lyddie already slept upstairs. The wind howled through the barren trees outside. Clara sat near the hearth, shawl draped around her shoulders, staring into the embers. Wyatt stood near the window, arms folded, jaw tight. At last he said, "I came across a letter today." Her shoulders stiffened. She did not look at him. "I should not have read it," he added softly. "I know," she whispered. Then, after a pause, "But you did." He nodded once. Silence stretched thick between them until she finally turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes betrayed her shame, fear, the ache of being seen too clearly. "I was a nurse," she said, her voice thin, "during the war. Not by training, only by need. There was a boy brought to us, no older than 8, wrapped in a Union flag. His mother held him as though he were still alive, but he was long gone." Her fingers clenched against her skirt. "Every night after that, I dreamed of his face." And then came the explosion. She touched her side unconsciously, as though still feeling the wound beneath her ribs. "They told me I was lucky to live, but the damage was done. I will never bear children." Wyatt listened, his gaze steady, not filled with pity, but with something sturdier. "You saved lives," he said quietly, "and carried scars most men could never endure." She blinked, surprised. "There are wounds that show," he continued, "and wounds no one can see. But you have endured both, and you stand stronger than anyone I have known." Her eyes shimmered, lips pressed tight. "I do not want your sympathy," she whispered. "You do not have it," he answered simply. "Only my respect." Their eyes held in the glow of the firelight. For the first time, Clara felt she was not seen as broken, but as whole. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was alive. She gave a faint smile. "Thank you." Wyatt inclined his head once, slow and certain. In that quiet room, with winter raging beyond the walls, a thread stretched between them, fragile but real. It was not yet love, but it was no longer distance, and it began with a drawing. Later, while changing the sheets on Lyddie's bed, Clara found another sketch tucked beneath the pillow. The girl had begun drawing often, simple scenes of horses or stick-figure families beneath bright suns. But this one was different, darker. Clara opened the page carefully. The lines were frantic, jagged. A small woman stood at the edge of the page, arms outstretched. Near her loomed a tall shadow, broad and threatening, dragging the woman away. Another figure lay on the ground. Above his head, in clumsy, crooked letters, were the words, "Pa is sleep." Clara stared at the picture a long while, her heart tightening. The paper shook in her hands. The drawing haunted Clara long after she discovered it. A small woman stood at the edge of the page, arms reaching out, while a looming shadow dragged her away. Beside them lay another figure, motionless. Above his head, in shaky letters, the words read, "Pa is sleep." That evening, Clara carried the sketch to the parlor where Wyatt was bent over the back door, oiling its hinges. She waited in silence until he finished, then extended the paper without a word. Wyatt glanced at it once and sat heavily, his face set. "She draws often," he said at last, his voice flat. "But not like this." Clara answered. He gave a short nod, more to himself than to her. The room chilled as silence settled between them. Clara's heart pounded, but she spoke carefully. "I have never asked, Wyatt, what happened to your wife?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he placed the paper aside, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. "I was drunk that night," he admitted, his words low and weighted. "We argued about something I do not even recall. What? She went upstairs with Lyddie, and I stayed by the fire with a bottle. I drank until I could not think. When I woke in the morning—" His voice trailed off. Clara leaned closer, her tone gentle. "What did you wake to?" His eyes lifted, hollow with memory. "Blood on my shirt, blood on the floor near the back door, and Margaret was gone. Her coat was missing, too." He rubbed both temples as if trying to press the truth from his skull. The sheriff came. They searched, but there was no body, no note, nothing. They called it a disappearance. "And you?" Clara asked softly. "They said she ran off." His jaw tightened. Others believed worse. Clara studied him. "Do you believe you harmed her?" His throat worked as he swallowed. "I do not know." The words shook. "I have prayed for a memory, a dream, even a glimpse. But there is only emptiness. Just the hangover and the blood I cannot explain." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow pressing on the roof. Clara's chest ached for him. "Why did you not tell me before she asked?" His gaze lifted to hers. "Would you have stayed if I had?" She could not answer. Later that week, while Wyatt took the wagon into town for supplies, Clara walked to a cabin near the edge of the woods. She had heard whispers in town about the widow who lived there, a sharp-tongued woman named Mrs. Abernathy. The door opened to reveal a wiry figure wrapped in a thick shawl, a scar running down her neck. Her single good eye studied Clara sharply. "You are Callahan's woman, are you?" she asked. "I am staying at Silver Creek Ranch," Clara answered cautiously. "I have questions. Mrs. Abernathy gave a dry chuckle. "Don't we all?" Clara explained everything: the drawing, the blood, Wyatt's lost memory. The old woman rocked slowly on her heels, listening. "That night, Mrs. Abernathy said finally, I heard something, a scream, near midnight. But my husband had already passed, and I was not about to go looking for trouble in the dark. Next morning, I saw tracks in the snow leading down the ridge from the Callahan place." Clara's breath caught. "One set too," the widow said. "But only one returned." Clara's heart pounded. "You told Sheriff Donovan?" The old woman's jaw hardened. "The sheriff is Wyatt's kin. He wanted no scandal. Told me to keep quiet. So I did." Her voice softened then. "But I always believed that boy deserved the truth, even if he was too broken to ask for it." Clara stood in the doorway, the wind tugging at her cloak, her mind whirling. Footprints, a scream, blood that Wyatt could not explain, and a child who remembered more than anyone had guessed. The past was not gone, it had only been sleeping. Back at the ranch, life inched forward. Though the snow showed no mercy, Something inside the home had begun to thaw. Each day carried small changes. Lyddie laughed now, her voice like the soft chiming of bells in spring. Clara taught her how to thread a needle, to ease the thread through cloth without pulling too tight. Their first project was a simple handkerchief. The stitches were uneven, the pattern crooked. But when the girl finished her first little flower, pride glowed in her face. Wyatt stood in the doorway that morning, arms crossed, his shoulders looser than usual. The hardness in his jaw softened. He said nothing, but Clara noticed. Later that afternoon, Wyatt led Lyddie outside. The sky hung pale and gray, flakes drifting down like feathers. He lifted the child onto the back of a chestnut mare. Her legs dangled far from the stirrups, but her grin stretched wide as the horizon.
"This one's gentle," Wyatt told her. "Her name's Lark."
Clara stood at the fence, her gloved hands resting on the worn wood, watching as Wyatt walked beside the horse, one steady hand on Lyddie's back, guiding her in a slow circle. Each time the child passed, she waved at Clara, laughter spilling out in bursts of joy.
"When the ride was done," Clara said softly, "she trusts you?"
Wyatt brushed snow from the girl's cap, lifting her down carefully. "I reckon she knows when someone is worth trusting." That night, a blizzard raged against the house. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters. Clara stepped out to fetch a forgotten bucket, her shawl too thin for the biting cold. The air cut her throat raw. Before she could return inside, Wyatt appeared behind her. Without a word, he lifted his heavy coat from his shoulders and draped it around her. "You'll freeze like that," he murmured. Their faces hovered close, almost too close. Snow clung to his lashes and the brim of his hat. His breath rose in small clouds that brushed against her cheek. His hands lingered as he adjusted the collar, his fingers brushing her skin. Clara looked up, and for the first time, his eyes were not cold.
They were tired, wounded, but open.
"Thank you," she whispered. He gave a short nod, then turned to open the door. Inside, the room glowed with firelight. Lyddie slept soundly in the rocking chair, her doll clasped tight in her arms. Outside, the storm roared, but here was golden warmth. "I met Margaret at a fair," Wyatt said suddenly, his voice softer than she had ever heard. Clara turned to him. "She wore blue, always blue," he continued, "even in winter. She used to laugh at the way I walked in boots, said I looked like a stiff ox." A fleeting smile tugged at his mouth before fading. "She kept this place alive long before I knew how. Taught me to cook, taught me how to hold Lyddie without shaking like a fool. I was no good with babies." Clara smiled gently. "She sounds strong." "She was," he said, his voice thick. Wyatt's smile flickered, a rare glimpse of the man he might have been before grief hardened him. But it faded as quickly as it came. He lifted his left hand, the gold ring catching the glow of the fire. "I still wear this," he admitted, "because I am afraid if I take it off, I will forget the sound of her voice." Clara's breath caught, slowly, carefully. She placed her hand over his chest, just above the steady beat of his heart. Her voice was gentle. "Maybe she wants you to remember something else now. Not just her voice, but the way she loved you, and how much you still have left to give." Wyatt swallowed hard. "I do not know how." "You do," Clara whispered. "You already are." His hand hovered just beneath hers, close but not touching. The storm outside howled mercilessly, rattling shutters and whistling down the chimney. But inside, a fragile warmth bloomed. For the first time since she had stepped across the threshold of Silver Creek Ranch, Clara did not feel like a guest. She felt like she had been expected all along. The snow began to ease in the days that followed, though the chill still bit at the air. Inside, the house carried a quiet rhythm, Clara stitching by the fire, Wyatt repairing what needed mending, and Lyddie's laughter echoing through the yard. But peace on the frontier often came with warning, as if it knew how fragile it was. One afternoon, Wyatt was beyond the southern fence tending the horses when a rider appeared. Clara shaded her eyes against the pale sun. The man dismounted slowly, his boots dragging in the snow, his coat thick with dust, his hat pulled low. There was something about the way he carried himself that felt too familiar. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, cautious. The man removed his hat. Beneath it was a weathered face, jaw tight as stone, eyes sharp as rusted nails. "Name's Jed Boone," he said. "I worked this place some years back. Heard Wyatt Callahan was still here." Clara nodded slowly, her throat tightening. Lyddie had appeared at her side, her small hand slipping into Clara's fingers. The moment the child saw him, her entire body stiffened. Without a word, she bolted back into the house. Clara called after her, but the girl was gone, vanishing down the hallway. Clara turned back to Boone. Her voice was tight. "You'll find him at the south fence." Boone tipped his head and walked away. Inside, Clara found Lyddie curled beneath the bed in the guest room, her little frame trembling. Clara knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, what is it?" The girl did not answer. Instead, she grabbed a piece of charcoal from the sewing table and scrawled on the wooden floorboards in frantic strokes. Clara watched as the picture came alive. A woman, a child, a man with a blade, and blood. The same shadowy figure from her earlier drawings. Clara's heart pounded. She stood quickly, reaching for the rifle mounted above the hearth. Before her fingers touched it, the door slammed open. Boone stood there, his gaze steady and cold. "She remembers, doesn't she?" he said with an eerie calm. Clara stepped back. "You killed her," she said, her voice low but firm. His smile was thin, never reaching his eyes. She was not supposed to be there. Neither was the kid. "But your man, Callahan, he was too far in his cups to see straight." He drew a knife from beneath his coat and stepped forward. "Can't risk her talking now." Clara lunged for the rifle, but Boone was faster. He knocked it aside, the weapon clattering to the floor. She tried to run, but his hand caught her arm and slammed her down. A scream tore from her throat as he raised the knife. Then, a blur. Lyddie burst from the hallway, shrieking in terror. Clara twisted, throwing herself between the blade and the child. The knife came down, slicing deep. Pain stole her breath as blood spread across her dress. Clara Wyatt's roar filled the doorway. The crack of a rifle split the air. Boone stumbled, clutching his side, rage and shock on his face. Wyatt advanced, eyes blazing, gun still raised. He kicked the knife away and dropped to Clara's side. Blood soaked the floor. "Stay with me," Wyatt pleaded, his voice raw. Clara's eyes fluttered. Beside her, Lyddie sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at her sleeve. Then the word burst from her lips, a word not heard in years. "Mama," Lyddie cried. "Mama, don't go." Wyatt froze, breath catching. Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks as she clung to Clara. Outside, neighbors drawn by the gunshot began to arrive. A former deputy recognized Boone at once, and Sheriff Donovan was called. With Lyddie's trembling testimony and the memory of a scream from years before, Boone's guilt unraveled quickly. He was taken into custody, his fate sealed, but none of it mattered to Wyatt in those hours. Clara's life hung by a thread. Fever took her. dragging her in and out of consciousness. Her skin grew pale as the moon, her breathing shallow. Wyatt never left her side. Through long nights he sat, cooling her brow with damp cloths, whispering her name, begging her to fight. Once, as the fever broke for a fleeting moment, she stirred. Her eyes found his. "You stayed," she breathed. "I never should have let you be hurt." He choked. A faint smile touched her lips. It was worth it. For her. From the doorway. Lyddie stepped softly inside. She climbed onto the bed, her small hands trembling as she placed a damp cloth on Clara's forehead, copying what she had watched Wyatt do. Then, her voice small but sure, she whispered, "She's my mama now." Wyatt's chest constricted, broken, breathless. He pressed Clara's hand to his lips. "You saved us both," he whispered. Days later, as the fire burned low. Clara stood by the window, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. Snow fell in slow spirals outside, covering the land in white silence. She watched it, knowing everything had changed. The wound across Clara's ribs had begun to knit, but the ache inside her refused to fade. She stood at the kitchen table that morning, pen trembling in her hand, and knew she could not remain. Not after all that had happened, not when she could never give Wyatt what Margaret once had. Her words spilled onto the page in slow, careful lines. "Dear Wyatt, you have given me a warmth I thought I would never feel again. But I am not whole. I cannot bear children, and you deserve more than I can offer. You and Lyddie need someone who can give you a real future, not just pieces of one. Please know that I love you both, but love is not always enough." She folded the letter with shaking hands and placed it on the mantel beneath the dusted portrait of Margaret Callahan. Then she turned away to pack. Upstairs. Lyddie stirred from her nap. The house lay hushed, too quiet. She padded down the stairs in her socks, doll clutched close. That was when her eyes caught the letter on the mantel. Her name appeared in the second paragraph, just after the words, "I cannot be her mother." Her chest tightened. She did not cry. Instead, she turned quietly, climbed the stairs, slipped on her boots and scarf, and eased out into the storm. By the time Clara noticed the front door ajar, the wind was already rising. Panic surged through her. She tore through the rooms, calling Lyddie's name. Nothing. "Wyatt," she screamed, rushing outside. "She's gone." Wyatt had just returned from the barn. He dropped the saddle into the snow, eyes wild. "What do you mean she's gone?" She read the letter. Clara gasped, guilt clawing at her. "She thinks I'm leaving because of her." Without another word, Wyatt sprinted for the barn. In practiced haste he saddled the mare, then hauled Clara up behind him. The storm thickened, white swallowing the horizon. The child's tracks were already vanishing beneath the wind. They searched the riverbed, the tree line. Their voices breaking against the storm, Lyddie Wyatt shouted into the gale, "Come back!" But only silence answered. Dusk was creeping. Clara's eyes caught a splash of blue beneath the trees. Wyatt slid from the saddle before the horse even halted. There, huddled beneath a twisted pine, lay Lyddie, arms around her doll, cheeks pale, eyes barely open. "Baby," Clara choked, falling to her knees. "What have you done?" The girl's lips trembled. "You don't want me anymore." Clara pulled her close, her body shaking. "No, I was never leaving you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was wrong." Wyatt knelt beside them, wrapping his coat around both child and woman, his hands trembling, his voice cracked. "Don't you ever run from us again. You are our little girl. Nothing changes that." Lyddie's arms tightened around Clara's neck.
"I want you to be my mama forever," she whispered.
Tears blurred Clara's sight as she pressed her forehead against the child's. "Then I will be forever, if you'll have me."
Wyatt's hand closed over Clara's, a silent vow passing between them. In the heart of the snow-covered forest, with the wind howling and the shadows of the past finally behind, a broken family began to mend. The next morning, the storm had passed. The land stretched wide and white, trees bending beneath the weight of snow. The air was sharp, still, clean. Inside the ranch house, the fire crackled gently. A pot of soup warmed on the stove, and the sound of life stirred again after a night of terror. Lyddie lay curled beneath a quilt beside Clara, their fingers twined together. She had not let go once since being found. Wyatt stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out across the pale horizon. His face was weary, but there was something lighter about him now, something resolved. After breakfast, he turned to Clara and Lyddie. "Come with me," he said. They bundled themselves in cloaks and scarves and stepped out into the fresh snow.
The world glittered under the morning sun, every branch etched in frost. They walked together, Wyatt leading them down toward the frozen creek, his steps measured, deliberate. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She did not know what he intended, only that this moment carried a weight that pressed deeper than the snow. The storm had passed, leaving the land blanketed in white. The creek shimmered beneath the winter sun, the air crisp and golden. Wyatt stopped at the edge of the frozen bank and turned toward Clara. His expression was solemn, yet beneath it there was a quiet strength, as though he had finally made peace with the past. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, his voice steady in the cold air, "thinking about what makes a family." Clara's heart stirred, already full. She waited, breath caught in her chest. From his coat pocket he drew a small velvet pouch. His rough hand shook slightly as he pulled out a ring, plain and worn from years of use. "I wore this too long," he confessed, lifting his left hand. Then, with deliberate care, he slid Margaret's wedding band from his finger and held it in his palm. "She's gone," he said, voice low, "and I loved her. But loving her doesn't mean I have to stop living." His gaze lifted, steady on Clara. "Lyddie needs a mother, and me. I need you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, blurring the snow-bright world around them. "Family isn't about where we come from," Wyatt continued. "It's about where we choose to stay." Then he dropped to one knee, the snow crunching beneath him. "I choose you, Clara Whitmore. Will you marry me?" Clara did not answer at once. Instead, she sank to her knees beside him, gathering Lyddie, who had followed close behind, into her arms. Her voice trembled as she whispered to the child, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry I ever made you think I didn't want you." Lyddie clung to her tightly, tears bright in her wide eyes. "I knew you did. I just got scared." Claire pressed a kiss to her hair, then turned to Wyatt. Her hand remained wrapped protectively around Lyddie's. "I was certain I had missed my chance to be part of something whole," she said softly. "I thought I was only good at leaving." Wyatt reached for her hand, his touch firm, grounding. "But you stayed," Clara finished, "and so will I." She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, I'll marry you." Wyatt's chest rose with a deep, shuddering breath. He slipped the ring onto her finger, the same ring once worn by Margaret, now carrying a new promise. A week later, the doors of the small church in Fort Redemption opened for a quiet wedding.
Townsfolk filled the pews, their faces warm with kindness. Whispers of the story had already spread how Clara Whitmore had bled to protect a child who had not spoken in years, and how Wyatt Callahan had found peace in a woman he had never expected. Wildflowers, simple but lovely, lined the aisle. Wyatt stood at the altar in his best shirt, his shoulders squared, though his hands betrayed a nervous tremor. Then the church doors opened wide. Clara entered in a modest dress borrowed from the town seamstress, her hair pinned with sprigs of lavender. But it was Lyddie who drew every eye. She walked proudly ahead in her blue dress, scattering petals with the innocent joy only a child could carry. When the preacher asked who would give the bride away, Lyddie's clear voice rang out without hesitation. "I do." Laughter rippled through the congregation. Wyatt's eyes glistened, his face alight in a way Clara had never seen before. The vows were spoken, simple words, but heavy with truth. When Wyatt kissed Clara, the room seemed to exhale all at once. Lyddie threw her arms around both of them, and together the three walked back down the aisle, stepping into the afternoon sun not as a man shackled by grief, nor as a woman running from her past, nor as a child lost in silence, but as a family bound by grace. That night, back at Silver Creek Ranch, the fire burned low. Lyddie slept peacefully between them, her doll tucked beneath her chin. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling in wonder. She whispered into the quiet, almost to herself. "I wasn't born to be a mother, but I was called to become one." Wyatt stirred, half asleep, and his hand found hers in the darkness. She turned her head and watched the slow rise and fall of Lyddie's chest, the little girl finally resting without fear. In that house, where so much had once been lost, something had finally been found. Life has a way of wounding us in places no one else can see. For Wyatt, it was the silence of grief. For Clara, it was the scar of war and the loss of her future as a mother. For little Lyddie, it was the memory of being left alone in a world too cruel for a child. Yet when these three lives collided, something remarkable happened. Healing began where none of them expected. The lesson is simple, yet profound. Family is not always given by birth, but chosen through love and sacrifice. Sometimes the people we least expect become the very ones who save us, at any age, especially in later years. It is easy to think that our story is finished, that what is broken will never be mended. But as this tale reminds us, the heart is capable of beginning again. Love asks us to stay when leaving seems easier. It asks us to risk pain for the chance of joy. And it teaches us that wholeness is not about what we can no longer give, but about what we choose to share today. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us on this journey across the frontier of love and loss. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is kept alive because of you. Until next time, may love always find its way to you, no matter the season.